history does not exactly repeat itself, but it sure as hell rhymes. Let's talk about Japan. And let's look into a little bit of Japanese history and parallel it with what is happening today. So, Japan began to grow as a superpower in the 1860s. This era is known as the Meiji era. The reason why they call it the Meiji era is because the emperor of Japan at this time was the Emperor Meiji. Now, what was going on at this time? Japan began to modernize itself. Japan began to learn about military technology and weapons from the West, and Japan also began to learn about military tactics, also from Western Europe. The Emperor of Japan, the Emperor Meiji, he sent out a team of Japanese researchers, investigators, to go into Europe and to pick the best of the West so that the Japanese could learn and become an empire. The Japanese essentially wanted the things that were necessary to form an empire, but the Japanese at the same time did not want to absorb everything from the Western world. The Japanese, for example, did not want Christianity. The Japanese simply wanted the ingenuity and the technological and military advancement of the West. So the Emperor Meiji sends out this team of scholars. They go into Western Europe and they learn. From the French, they learned a system of law. From the British, they learned naval warfare. And from the Germans, they learned how to run an army. It's very fascinating. It doesn't really surprise me that they would learn those things from those particular countries, given the history of those countries. Given the specialties of those countries. The British Navy, very, very famous. The French, of course, known for law and diplomacy. And the Germans, known for the capacity to form an empire. And so the Japanese returned and they say, this is what we learned. We learned law from the French, we learned naval warfare from the British, and we learned how to run an army from the Germans. Military tactics from the Germans. And the Japanese began to advance themselves. They began to adopt and to absorb Western ingenuity. And so, thus is the beginning of Japan as a world superpower. Now, of course, much of the Western world did not really expect Japan to become the superpower that it would eventually become, because Japan was considered to be a nation of the yellow race, and there was no way that a people of the yellow race could ever eclipse the powers of the white race, the political or the governmental powerhouses of the white race. So no one was really worried about Japan. Well, no one in the West was worried about Japan. The Chinese were worried. And the Chinese wanted to instill fear into the hearts of the Japanese, and they wanted the Japanese to believe that they had the superior military force. The Chinese were learning from the British about naval technology and naval warfare. They were also learning from the Germans as well. And the Chinese, they had two big naval fleets, and they were German-made. And the Chinese parked these two giant ships right onto the Japanese coast in order to scare the Japanese. And at first, the Japanese were nervous. They saw these giant Chinese fleets. They were much bigger than any of the naval ships that the Japanese had. And so the Japanese were understandably so concerned to a certain extent. But there was a Japanese investigator who entered one of the ships. He snuck inside dressed up as a civilian, and he saw how unorganized the Chinese were. He saw how dirty they were, how messy they were, how unpolished and unpunctual they were. And he dispelled a lot of the fears that the Japanese had. He said, these Chinese sailors are really a joke. They're really not that scary at all. We could take them out pretty easily. So the Japanese, they continued on what they were doing. And the Japanese were very much so focused on a particular country, and that was Korea. The reason why was because, well, whoever controlled Korea controlled really the pathway into China, and also vice versa, the pathway into Japan. If the Russians or the Chinese invaded Korea, they could easily then invade Japan. But if the Japanese invaded Korea, they could just as easily invade China. So both the Chinese and the Japanese were fixated on Korea, and the Russians as well, understandably so, because the Russians were very much so interested in controlling East Asia. And they were also concerned about a rising Japan. The Japanese were very much so worried about a rising China and a rising Russia. Now, at this time, the late 1800s, the nation of Korea was split between those who were pro-Chinese and those who were pro-Western modernization. Remind you of something? North and South Korea. The North is pro-Chinese, the South is pro-West. Well, in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, Korea was split between those who were pro-China and those who were pro-West, who were in favor of, adopting the ways of the West. And, well, the Chinese, they wanted to control Korea. They had their little puppets and their proxies. And the Japanese also wanted to control Korea. So what did they do? They flooded Korea with their troops. Chinese troops and Japanese troops flooded Korea. And inevitably, there was a war. And the Koreans, who hated the Japanese, who hated the idea of modernizing, they revolted. The Japanese squashed the revolt, and they hung, I think, like 1,000 people or something. And eventually they had a war with China. This is known as the First Sino-Japanese War. They had a war with the Chinese, and they utterly vanquished the Chinese. They crushed them. The Americans sat by and watched because the Americans didn't like the Chinese either. The Americans were also worried about a rising China. And when the Japanese crushed the Chinese, they established essentially a Japanese satellite or puppet state in Korea controlled by the Koreans who were pro-Western modernization. Well, this terrified the Russians. And the Japanese knew that if they were going to become the dominating powerhouse of East Asia, they had to defeat the Russians. So, in 1904, the Japanese led an attack on the Russian Navy in Port Arthur. Now, the Russians had a very difficult time in retaliating. They had to get a bunch of naval ships from the Baltic Sea, or they had to get their navy from, they had to get ships from their Baltic fleet into Port Arthur to fight off and to repulse the Japanese. But it was very difficult because the ships had to travel a long way from the Baltic region into East Asia. And every time the Russian Navy would stop to get supplies, they would only get supplies enough for a day. Why? Because everybody was terrified of angering the British. Because after the Japanese defeated China in 1894, the British were so impressed that they made an alliance with the Japanese. This is known as the Anglo-Japanese Alliance. And part of the Anglo-Japanese Alliance was that if anyone declared war on the British, the Japanese would defend the British, and vice versa. If anyone declared war on the Japanese, the British would aid the Japanese. So people were worried that if they gave supplies to the Russians, too much supplies to the Russians, they would be seen as aggressors against the Japanese and would thus anger the British. So the Russian Navy was being suffocated of supplies. By the time they came to the battle, they didn't have enough supplies, the soldiers were utterly exhausted, and they were utterly vanquished. And there was the Battle of Tsushima, in which literally tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were massacred. The Americans were so impressed by this that the Americans, under Theodore Roosevelt, said that we should just empower the Russians so that they could become a superpower against the Russians and the Chinese. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt would order all American troops to withdraw from Korea, and he would also tell all the Europeans to also withdraw their troops from Korea, hence empowering the beginning stage of the Japanese Empire. So what do we have in this era, in this epoch? We have a rising Japan. At the same time, we have a rising China. We have Korea split between those who are pro-China and those who are pro-West. We have a rising Russia. We have tensions between Russia and the Japanese. And, well, what do we have today? We have Korea split between the North and the North being pro-China, the South being pro-West. We have a rising Japan. We also have a rising Russia. We have an expanding Russia. We have a rising China. We have the perception that China could eclipse the Japanese, just like in the late 1800s. We have the United States supporting the Japanese, telling the Japanese, yeah, you guys should become more militarily powerful. History does not exactly repeat itself, but it sure as hell rhymes.